on lui donne le respect. Merci beaucoup. The honourable member for Mount Royal.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et je vais partager mon temps avec l'honorable député de Kingston and the Islands. Et j'aimerais remercier la députée de Vancouver-Est pour avoir lancé ce débat. I want to change a little bit the tone of the debate because, first of all, this should be nonpartisan, but second of all, more importantly, there are lessons to be learned from this debate. I've heard a lot of congratulatory comments tonight about how Canada we're different, how in Canada we've had this incredible tradition of bringing in immigrants and refugees, and we've always done it. And while it's true that in the last few decades, we've had a very good tradition about bringing in immigrants and refugees to this country, that has not always been true. I got into politics, federal politics, from municipal a few years ago. Why did I do so? One of the important reasons was Quebec's Charter of Values. The separatist government in Quebec came forward with a law that said that as a mayor, I had to fire people because they were going to wear a kippa or a hijab or a turban to work. And in my conscience, in the conscience of my council in the city of Côte Saint-Luc, we could not do that. And we held a rally for religious freedom on the steps of our city hall, bringing together people and religious leaders from all faiths to say no, because that is not Canadian. But the fact that we lived this only a couple of years ago in my home province of Quebec means that Canadian governments, provincial governments, politicians are no different here than they are elsewhere. People can always capitalize on xenophobia. People can always spark fear in the population. And we are so lucky to live in a country where all three of our major parties all share the view that Canada is a place that immigrants and refugees should be welcomed, and that we should care about people, whatever their race, religion, sexual orientation, or nationality. We should all be happy about that. So when it comes for me to talk about the U.S. executive order, which is the subject of the debate, I want to first say that, of course, as quasi-Americans, since we all watch U.S. TV, listen to U.S. pundits, watch the election campaign with the same intensity that our colleagues down south did, we also have to remember we're not American. And we don't have the rights that the people do in the U.S. to choose their president. So while I'm profoundly shocked by what's in this executive order, it is an American decision, and I applaud the protesters at airports. I applaud those in Congress who are fighting this, and I applaud those who are going to court. But what I want to do is I want to look at this executive order as if somebody proposed it in Canada, and then comment on it as if a Canadian politician proposed this. So what are the things we should learn about this order? Number one, you don't put forward executive orders without consultation. You don't forget to ask your State Department and the people that work there, who are the experts, what the ramifications are of an executive order. You don't forget to ask your Attorney General, who has to defend an executive order in court, whether it complies with the Constitution of your country or the laws of your country. You don't forget to consult with the enormous number of stakeholders who would be concerned with such an order. And I hope in Canada, before our executive asks, it will always consult with Parliament and parliamentary committees and other groups who have interest in it before taking action. Number two, you don't do executive orders that impact people who are already in transit, going based on valid visas that you yourself have issued. Orders should not be made retroactively. People have a right to depend on government laws setting in place for a period of time, and they have the right to travel, not wondering if when they get to their country where they have a visa, they're going to be excluded. Third, you don't discriminate based on country of origin or religion when you are making law. You don't say that just because people are born in one country or citizens only of one country or come from only one religious group, because there's an exemption for those who are from religious minorities, that you are excluded from a country. That is not what I believe in Canada. I don't think any of us do. But this is where I want to draw our history to your attention. We have to remember that we in Canada, as they have in the past in the US, have done this. And there have been many times in our history where the United States has been more welcoming than Canada. We should not congratulate ourselves on just being better than everyone else. There was a period of time when Chinese were excluded from the right to immigrate to Canada. So were other Asians, so were Sikhs, so were Hindus, so were people from all over Asia. Eastern Europeans were discriminated against. Southern Europeans were discriminated against in the 20s and 30s. And of course, I come from the Jewish community. And we all remember that when the Jewish community needed Canada the most, in the 30s, when Hitler was in power, the doors of Canada were closed to Jewish refugees. Irving Abellah's None is Too Many is a wonderful book that explains what happened, but let's talk about the process of the St. Louis. The St. Louis was a ship that came out of Hamburg in May of 1939 with people who had valid visas to Cuba. They were celebrating they were going to be saved from what was happening to them, being persecuted in Germany. And yet when they arrived in Havana Harbor, Cuba unilaterally changed its rules and invalidated what until then were valid visas for these immigrants coming to Cuba validly. That's what happens when you retroactively change things. Cuba denied entry, and so the ship steamed up toward the United States with the hope that the United States would open its doors, but the United States didn't open its doors. And then there was just one hope before they went back to Europe, and that was Canada. And Mr. Blair and Mr. King closed the doors of Canada to those refugees. I hope one day a Canadian government will apologize for what happened with the St. Louis. But we have to remember that this can happen here. So coming to the end of my speech, Madam Speaker, because it's wrapping up quickly, one of the things I wanted to say is we should always remember that this can happen here. We have to be vigilant. Number two, we have to look at what happened in the order. I think the government acted appropriately by clarifying immediately that Canadian citizens and permanent residents of Canada should not be affected by the order. That was the appropriate first thing to do. Then we have to look at whether we increase the number of privately sponsored refugees or allow more refugees into Canada as a result. I think the government should be open to considering raising the number of privately sponsored refugees. I think the total number of refugees would have to be an international agreement because we can't unilaterally react to what one country does when we are just one small country of the globe. But I think we should be talking to our international counterparts to see if there's an international action. And with respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement, I want to say that I've looked into this and I don't see where, right now, somebody could be impacted by being refused entry to the United States as a refugee, having reached the shores of the United States, and then come to Canada. That's where this would apply. The minister has an obligation to look at all four pillars of the agreement on an ongoing basis. I am assuming that he will. If we see the United States actually refusing people who reach their shores according to international conventions from being considered to be refugees over the next 120 days, I am confident the minister will react. At this point, what I understand from the United States is they are not acting that way to people who reach their shores, but it's something important to consider. So thank you for giving me this time, Madam Speaker. Thank you to the NDP for raising this issue.
Questions and comments?